Delicate Subject, Chapter 45. Garrus. The onus of command did not suit him. He almost laughed. Did not suit him. Terribly Thane phrasing. It was fucking impossible. Jane did not make it look easy, but she did make it look inevitable. Garrus was sane and cautious, and therefore command of this situation did not suit him, and was fucking impossible. He stared at the mess of intel, thought of the thousands of discrepancies related to how Jane needed things to proceed and how they would actually proceed. Evidence was building toward imminent invasion. Scouts were being lost. Long-range communication lines broken down. He couldn't tell her. He had to tell her. This was his command, but he held it for her. She would hate him if he didn't tell her. But brain surgery meant possible cognitive deficits, possibly developing complications, possibly permanent, until she passed Karen's inspection. So far, things looked fine, but so far she was blind and in denial about her limb loss, unwilling to discuss it. Not that anybody asked. Knowing her, it was not likely pathological denial, but her instant acceptance of costs and her desire to spare her crew and mates from the pain. With her, though, acceptance and denial could be indistinguishable, equally insidious and damaging. Sacred liar. He knew her well enough, but that did not make it less painful. And how the hell would he even know if she had a cognitive deficit residual? Karen had cautioned him regarding expectations for recovery. She may not recover. She was slick reassurance and gentle smiles, unseeing eyes, and unseen missing arm. She had gotten better at being injured and caring for herself, and somehow that made it worse. At the collector base, he had been too injured to aid her. At her abduction, he had been useless. She was injured, and it was her reassuring him more often than not. He could intellectually grasp the necessity, knew this woman well enough to see it as sanity and in character and not brain injury. It did not make it less wrong or less frightening. It was right for her, wrong for him, to not at least spend a moment in mourning, in shared loss and memorial, to let it go together. But she seemed to have fully mourned before he'd gotten her armor off. Had she accepted her own personal losses of body, mind, and soul so completely that she no longer counted them as costs? She did die, Vakarian. She did have her mind robbed from her. How could you judge where this woman has had to walk and what landscape is familiar to her? You're not afraid she's lost her soul. You're afraid that if you'd lost your arm, you'd never recover. You're afraid that if you lost your mind, you would never recover. You're afraid you could never measure up to that standard. He pondered what she had already accomplished and could not fathom her A to B process. There was no recipe, no way to learn her method of success. It all looked like, to him, Step 1, choose an insane goal. Step 2, get lucky. It seemed superstitiously possible that, as Thane believed, she was some earth goddess and lesser mortals did not have her vision or her luck. Not that losing an arm was lucky. And he was grateful for not being in an STG experimental think tank where they invented fun new ways to interrogate and perhaps indoctrinate for their own agenda. He had been essentially sitting on his tactical ass while Jane was in the medbay, smiling and infuriatingly cheerful. He'd been informative on some points, vague or delinquent on others. Details about Eurydice came easy, but warning her about the oncoming storm that she already knew was coming was not going to be introduced as a topic. Was it? Should it? Professionally, she should be thrilled by what she'd accomplished every single day of the rest of her admittedly, possibly short life. And so should he. And he was, but he was also infuriated that his bondmate was insane and most likely to end up in a violent grave soon. Or worse, taken and indoctrinated and the model for future collectors, someday only vaguely human in shape, possibly retaining dark hair and moon ice eyes. He had his own nightmares. His churning fear of her not surviving brain surgery had faded, but what remained was a thin, bitter shell of resentment that seemed unaffected by the nova of uncontrolled emotion that sat in the space of his heart where the thought of her resided. He could no longer justify to himself that she was not at least partially insane, deluded. It worked for her, but was undeniable. It was that determined insanity that checked his tongue. She would not accept healing as her job when Reapers called. It had gotten her killed. It would get her killed again. She had a contagious, coercive charm. It was like venom, some sense she projected and he could not resist, that when leaving her orbit he could not duplicate as he stewed in all the things that could go wrong, were going wrong, while she focused on the slim possibilities of what could go right at great cost. With her life and livelihood as the first calculated column of expenses, he knew in his bones, in his plates, that if he told her of the invasion, she would be off, slipping through all intended restraint and checks on her power, and she would be followed by those too afraid to check her logic or competence. This demanded moment of sanity and peace and healing would be dispelled and brain injury. And it would mean that there was no more preparation. Full war, full commitment. She would fight nonstop as she lost limbs and her brain deteriorated. And he would not be able to stop her except to take this excruciatingly horrific moment in time and force her to heal. Would she forgive him? He seemed to pick up resentment like a charge from every surface until it built up like static. Resentment and fear. He liked it, in point of fact, and childish as that was, it made him feel like he had some level of autonomy and individual thought. He stared at his console, realizing he was not going to be able to focus until he worked some of this out of his system. Jim. Now. He rarely took breaks, but now was the time, or he'd be fuming and useless, thought bottlenecked and dictated by resentment and fear. He was out of the battery, tangentially passing the med bay, where he would possibly be seen looking purposeful and off to do something useful, and where the fuck were they? No smiling, blind Shepard, no tastefully attentive Thane. He almost lightened up fractionally in his sullen dramatics, but his sullen dramatics verified he'd better get his temper under control before finding his bondmates sedately taking a tastefully attentive walk, with him appearing as though he wanted to punch them. He didn't think they were tastefully taking a walk. He thought Thane had Jane up against a wall somewhere because that man had returned from his mission smelling like adolescent lust every moment of every day. Jane always thought sex was the best idea ever, other than the ones she had where she got herself killed. They were smiling and sedate, had no other issues other than wanting to get their hands on each other. They were perfect, really. And Garrus had been the main beneficiary since Thane's return of appreciation of adolescent lust. Jane's lust had been a commodity as necessary and abundant as oxygen. At least he knew he did not impose his lust on them. They would insist. No doubts there of being wanted. And loved. He was loved. They were perfect. He was not. He assumed his quarters were safe. Thane would likely have dragged her to his lair, with her pushing at his back to get there faster. Garrus went to his own chaste quarters with a hint of a feral smile and changed into something more appropriate for punching things. He did not make it out of the room without the random emotional static discharging into another dent of distressed metal. He was going to have to replace the entire panel. The metal was warped from repeated hits, and heat wouldn't bring it back to baseline anymore. Words from his combat instructors swirled in his head, admonitions and advice that never really worked on him. Yes, sex and violence eased stress, but he had always been too inherently stressed for his instructors. He should be steady as plate, tough as hide. The best they'd managed was to get him to learn how to fake it. He could be all those things externally, but internally he had always been, in the opinions of instructors, his father, and even his loving Vakarian family. Too self-involved, too willing to involve himself in others' business. He did not keep to his awareness, the personal space of a Turian. There were awareness and attack, duty to self and duty to others, and those concepts had always had the wrong boundaries. Un-Turian-like boundaries. Those concepts fell on him and fit him as badly as command did. He could fake it. He could hide behind it. Right now, he could protect Jane from something she felt entitled to be eviscerated by, and take the ignorance of that upon himself. He could only do it for a short window of time, in which so many people would die. He could pretend to keep to his awareness and know his own boundaries. He could pretend to a different attack with the clear, concise medical and military boundaries that Karen prescribed. It would be impossible, and he would fail to justify it after the fact, and she would know the lie. And she would forgive him, and people would still be dead. He had no answers to save those from the first wave of invasion. Jane had put no plans in place. He had no playbook to follow, just an open-ended horror and certainty. The root of his crashing guilt and regret was that he had wasted 2 years. 2 years in which he should have sat at the threshold of the Citadel Tower and shouted about Reapers. He should have. He knew it. He needed to make up for that, now, with this moment of command, but he found himself sitting still again, paralysis his only recourse, trying to urge himself to meaningful action as he should have after her death. Thane and Jane both had excuses for not being able to prepare for those 2 years. Thane had not known of the threat, and Jane had been dead. But Garrus was guilt incarnate. His adolescent fury then had translated into his righteous extermination of daily regrowing scum on Omega. Jane was righteous Every ounce of that woman's will poured into stopping the only threat that mattered. Garrus, without her, had devolved into vengeful suicide. He felt the creep toward the helplessness that had gripped him after her death and needed to beat back that blinding despair. The irony was that he was not fit for their company until he was in their company. The fury and howling internal score of recriminations never ceased until they gave him permission. But he could not seek that permission without deserving it. He would never deserve it because of those 2 years. He was the only one of the 3 that had failed so completely to stay on awareness and attack task, evaluate personal needs against the needs of the group, and rise to dedication. Thane had given his life to what he believed was the salvation of his own species. Jane was so unerringly on task. She was the figurehead for that task. Garrus had collapsed. Without her return, he would have been a pseudonym and a parable, his head on a spike, left as a warning that would have worked against anybody else attempting the same thing. Resurgent scum would have ruled Omega until the Reapers came and eradicated them where Garrus could not. Lost. Futile. Alone, he saw himself that way, without the Drell signposts and the human destiny. Just a Taurian with a heart that collapsed without them. He was not the fight incarnate. He had no signposts, and right now he had fear and desperation. Bonded, it became worse and better, and he was lost to their scent, their signposts and destiny, and his feet trailing after. So, really, fuck command and its demands. One thing he could count on was his strength and his speed, and he would have his own blood, his own hands for momentary and needed release of the stress that seemed to boil in him constantly. He needed it out of his hands when he touched her. A small voice informed him. She's gonna feel it anyway. Fuck. He started to hit things, his own customized practice methods and dummy made to be practically indestructible, unlike his quarters. The same voice reminded him, he wants to feel it. Spirits, they both wanted to feel it, to force him away from all self-control until talons drove into flesh and more instructors, echoing voices. Wrong way, Garrus Vakarian. Never literally the wrong way, just that he developed his own style, and it was never Taurian enough. He was too loose in his sighting discipline. He'd been branded lucky. It had not been a compliment. Ironically, they had thought he was lucky, and he had thought he was a prodigy. They could never get him to show his work, but he always came up with the right solution. Maybe he did have something in common with Jane. His smile was grim as he tried to quiet the clamor in his head by speeding up the workout. Sometimes he could at least not make things worse if it was not demanded that he make things better. So his command style was a holding pattern. The time his only directive had been to find her, he had failed. Wrong way, Garrus Vakarian. So, hold his ground and fight like hell. He inched up the speed of his strikes just to hold still and not lose ground. He would have to go back to every last one of those dispatches that caused his mind to explode, analyze them, and synthesize the answers the best he could. He might not be a natural at destiny or paths, but damned if he couldn't learn and work hard in the meantime for the right cause. Initial path clear, he focused on the force it took to not shatter his own plate on invincible targets. Thane's arrival to the gym was simultaneously two things: jarring and familiar. His arrival was as welcome and necessary as Garrus's next breath, but just seeing the man now made his heart pound harder than it had from exertion, and the scent of Jane on Thane's skin. Comprehending how the two of them meshed together still did not allow Garrus to fit into their clockwork whir, like an anatomy, chirality, and expectation. They had insidious, recursive minds that folded back in on each other in filigree intimacy with delicate tendrils that dug into each other and took root. Wrong way, Garrus Vakarian. But Thane was the right way, and he knew it. He landed one final wound-up punch that had the dummy vibrating in a satisfying ring. Thane's presence and his perceptive eyes and understated ability to catch scent better than a human, but not as well as a Taurian. Garrus had looked it up, was so often welcome, but right now made Garrus nervous. There had been times when Jane had been gone, and Thane had sparred with him until he was exhausted, because Garrus needed it. He didn't want to need it. He didn't want to need this violence, chaos, to get to what he did need, his mind determining his own path. Thane's face promised redirection. He may not be insidious or recursive. Garrus might be the easiest book for Thane to read, but he didn't have to like it. When Jane had been gone, Thane had helped bleed off the seeping guilt that Garrus could not keep out of his blood, suffocating from it the way Thane had suffocated from Kepral's. Thane was the only person Garrus permitted to wear him down, wear him out. The necessity of command reasserted itself as a separate demand. His energies did have a direction, needed a direction, and he needed to find it. This last week, Garrus had been drowning in guilt of Jane's injury. They both had been weighed down. Worry and guilt mixed in with fury and helplessness. Thane hid it terribly well, but Garrus could still smell it on him. Thane's time with other Drell, or the knowledge of Bond, or both, had fundamentally changed his scent to Garrus's perception. Where Thane had once been ethereal, unattainable, a gift, he was now incontrovertibly his, to Garrus's blood and body. With Jane's scent on him, he was near irresistible, and although Garrus reveled in that right, at the moment it was anathema to command, to breathing normally, to doing anything normally with Thane sharing his oxygen. He was technically on duty, but he couldn't really use that as an excuse, considering all the times he had strong-armed Jane into abandoning her duty in favor of sex. Garrus had waylaid Thane and Jane, both, enough times in this gym to have no excuses. He did it because it worked. He would like to keep his thoughts private, did not want to burden Thane as well, but with the look on Thane's face as he shrugged out of his jacket, Garrus would be lucky to get out of this room with ownership of his own teeth. What on Palaven possessed him to bond to a fucking Drell assassin? I'm pretty sure I didn't have a choice there. With Thane's jacket set aside, he gestured Garrus out onto the mats, and Garrus moved to the familiar position, ready to get his ass handed to him. Hiding something from Thane was impossible. He could try to play dumb. Maybe Thane would buy that, or at least allow him to pretend. Garrus wasn't ready to discuss command decisions, and he wasn't ready to tell Thane no and arouse suspicion. Thane faced him and asked, "What troubles you?" Oh, fuck. Garrus tried honesty. "I'm not ready to discuss it. It's a command issue." Thane seemed to ignore that and let it pass, to Garrus's relief. Thane asked, "Had we bonded on Palaven, would Jane and I have traditionally taken your name?" Okay. Huge shift in gears. Garrus began moving through the form Thane had taught him, adapted to a practice of push hands. Move, counter-move, no active aggression, more of a dance. Balance and flow. Warm-up. Garrus answered informatively, used to Thane's redirection. "No, Turians are matrilinear." Garrus thought, but didn't say, something I'm sure you forced someone to confess at some point, and certainly have not forgotten. Thane knew so much more about bonding than he should. Thane had been the one to explain it to Jane. Thane said, helpfully, "So we would have taken her name." If she were Turian, if there were only one of us, and if anybody had a choice in the matter. Thane's face was concentrated, focusing on where hands were moving and not looking at Garrus's face. "We all had choices, Garrus. We all chose." Declarative. To argue would be ingracious and rude and unspeakably selfish, and Thane had ended that line of conversation. Garrus knew not to apologize or backtrack. This is why he did not wish to share his current mood, to imply that bonding wasn't something that he would have chosen. And this was only the warm-up. Thane was reading his mind, reading his body, triangulating, and Garrus was fucked. He did not repeat that he had no choice in the matter, barely restrained himself from breaking form in frustration and stalking back to the CIC where Thane would not pursue. His ambush is always private. He might buy some time. It seemed his best option, so he remained silent, keeping his face schooled to observing the form until it had run to the end. Tactical retreat seemed wisest. More wound up than he'd been when he got here, like a boat with several holes, destined to sink if he didn't spend his time bailing. And he was a Turian. He would sink with it. He stepped away, moving toward the exit, at the polite end of the form. The expectation was to continue on to combat drills, but he was not going to give Thane further opportunities to analyze him. It was necessary that Garrus be capable of analysis without assistance or puppetry. He should tell Jane. Share the burden. It was her chosen burden. Thane's hand reached for his wrist as Garrus retreated. Attempted to retreat. In a flash rearrangement of the concerns of command, getting to Jane now seemed like a right, and Thane an obstruction. An intentional obstruction. Wrong way, Garrus Vakarian. Fuck, there was no right way. He tried to pull his wrist away gently, but Thane did not let go. In Vasnam. Do not leave. It wasn't a command, but Garrus felt it ring with the echoes of 1,000 past commands in his head, venom racing through his blood, all things from this man's mouth perfection. Thane's soft words raced down Garrus's spine and vibrated in his gut. Attraction and momentary repulsion, born of trying to protect the inside of his head from being peeled and opened for Thane's perusal. Too many things in his head clamored, "Too late, wrong way," and Garrus said, "I just need to think." "Think with me. Let me aid you. I just need to talk to Jane." "No, not as you are. A concern of command is a concern for her command, but not at the moment. I am here. Share the burden with me." Garrus almost sank to his knees to do exactly that. But he was too far gone to recrimination and belief that there was no solution, that there could be, should be, no arbiter or perspective beyond his own. He had let too much time pass. Thane's gentle intent and calm assurance of being able to help was irritating. Garrus's head rang with the stubborn assertion that he had determined his course of action and was adamant on it. Right or wrong, it was a choice, and wasn't that what command demanded? Choosing. Alone. "Garrus, you are on the edge of violence. You know it. I know it. Jane must not know it. Do you understand? I cannot let you leave this room. Not as you are." The phrase, "not as you are," had been repeated twice in Thane's calm voice, and Garrus heard it as rejection of who he was. He would tell her. Thane would forgive him for leaving. Jane would forgive him for withholding information this far. He was certain of it. The right choice involved getting out and getting to her before his resolve failed. As he was. He wanted to cup his hand under Thane's jaw and run him back to the wall, inform him that as he was perfectly acceptable. He restrained himself, barely, because he was afraid that was what Thane wanted. Hands on him. An excuse for venom, for command, and Garrus's resolve would peel away. Don't kid yourself, Vakarian. Your restraint has distinctly peeled. If you want command, you have to fight for it. You have to earn it. And you can't cave to the most beautiful man you have ever encountered, whose skin and voice makes you sway his way. That he belongs to you and that you have a right to his skin and voice is a distraction, not salvation. I apologize for cutting this workout short. I will see you later. Right now, He turned away, broke eye contact, and within seconds realized that Thane's warning had not been idle. He should have learned by now that Thane's warnings were absolute, but Garrus had been lulled by the fact that he'd never needed to give them. Green and black muscle had slackened and softened in Turian grip, to later tense but not break any hold Garrus applied. But the rules changed now. Right now. They had fought, sparred in Thane's controlled way, passionate but never to cause injury. With Garrus's back turned, Thane had destabilized Garrus's leg, shoved him forward, and had Garrus's surprised and nerveless hands beyond his back and held in stasis with one hand. Thane's biotics humming. Garrus's head was wrenched to the side with Thane's other hand at his larynx's near to crushing force. Implied severe damage with movement or struggle. Okay. He was listening now. And spirits help him. Inescapably impressed, turned on, ashamed, surprised, and mostly turned on. I did warn you, Garrus. I cannot let you leave this room. Not as you are. I apologize for any discomfort in ensuring that. I find your body magnificent, and avoiding injury to fringe or spur in a Turian is a challenge, one I do not wish to fail. My training is to kill, not restrain. I am improvising. I value your voice, and I do not wish for a struggle to injure you. You must speak. I must understand. I am not negotiating. I am informing you of an outcome. Your demeanor has convinced me of the need for my intervention. You will forgive my directness, and I will forgive your attempted evasion. Spirits help him on his knees. With the choice taken from him, he was grateful. Part of his solitary horror relaxed, and he said, "So I'm just supposed to ignore that your cock is pressed to the side of my neck?" Hard cock. Thane leaned in closer, compensating for the hold on Garrus's throat. Neither of us need ignore it if you accept my set boundaries. I will not allow you to leave until you have convinced me that it is wise that you do so. Garrus thought briefly of venom and compulsion, that Thane could have kissed him and had the truth in moments. Unless Garrus left Thane unconscious in this room, which he was not prepared to do. Thane could still do that, and it would not be wise to push him to that. This was Thane being direct. Effectively direct. Spirits, he smelled like her. The twining of the scents of his bondmates on hide was not as evocative as blood, but Garrus's head swam with lust. The cutting, seething edge of command that had pressed to his spine receded and was blunted, and all he had was Thane's focus and intent. The rushing edge of the need to flee from this room and into impulsive action faded. Not enough to make it easy for Thane, but maybe the spirits had helped him with the arrival of his bondmate. Maybe they could both accomplish what he had wanted to accomplish when he had entered this room. Clear his head. Bail effectively. Find a way. Going to Jane clouded in effectiveness, and some of his shame followed that path and was lost as the possibility receded. Going back to dispatches clouded in effectiveness, and some of his frustration dissipated. Listening to why Thane thought he should not leave this room seemed wise. Hard hands, hard words, and hard cocks might change that to Thane's satisfaction and Garrus's. Who said he wasn't resourceful and opportunistic? Then let me up, and let's finish what we started. Without hesitation, he was free. Thane stepped to his place on the mat. The next traditional step of their workout, a spar. Not as orchestrated as push hands. No intent to hit, but intent to train. Usually. With the indentation and scent of Thane's hand and the still warm press of leather to the side of his throat, considering the circumstances, he believed Thane could take care of himself in a more aggressive spar. As if to act out the agency of command and consequence, in light of his being recently on his knees, Garrus attacked with speed and power, discovering Thane was simply not there when Garrus's blow missed, intended for Thane's abdomen. His talons were not out, would not extend his reach or dig into flesh. He would allow for conversation, but Thane would earn his information. Thane accepted Garrus's conditions, apparently, repeating exactly as he had upon arrival. What troubles you? Garrus tried to keep his voice steady, circling for an opening, letting out a grunt as he lunged again for Thane, but Thane evaded it with a spin and a dig into his back, near plate-cracking velocity. I believe what I've seen from reports that long-range communications are being disrupted, scouts are disappearing, and it is likely the first step to the massive Reaper invasion predicted by the information we got at the collector base. Thane's expression did not change, though he thought intently, but still evaded another jab, got in a kick to Garrus's thigh. And you intended to tell Jane? Garrus growled, went for a feint, and lunged for Thane's proposed spin out of the way, got in an elbow dig on Thane's abdomen, a long scrape along muscle. A short, appreciative noise from Thane in an outrush of breath. I was considering not telling her, then considering telling her, then I was convinced I must tell her in the course of my thoughts. You must not. That was followed by Thane making a tight feint and turn under and around to land a hit at Garrus's back. But Garrus was able to follow the direction, got Thane's legs out from under him and had him flat on the mat, unable to take advantage with his own back exposed. Thane was up and unseen before he could grapple. Garrus growled again, breath harsh as he tried to locate Thane's position, saying, "It's her mission. It's her command." Thane shook his head, and Garrus took his momentary self-distraction to land a punch on Thane's face, lip split along the central furrow. Thane behaved as though that had not happened, other than to use Garrus's proximity to strike at his knee, not enough to injure, again, but enough to hurt. Those statements are true, but not complete truth. There is medical truth. Garrus snorted in derision and wanted to charge and tackle, but knew it would result in him flat on his face. Instead, the necessity of the spar forced calm and calculation into him, that inevitable transformation from frustration to resolution. Maybe he did orgasm. Maybe this was his corollary. Garrus said with all the contempt he felt for the flimsy cover of medical truth, "You think she's going to buy, for a moment, that I believed she would be fine, not knowing that I waited the 3 fucking weeks until she recovers? When she finds out, she'll want to peel my mandibles off and tack them to the galaxy map as a warning. She will never trust me again." Thane nodded in agreement. She will want to do that. She would never do that, however. It is impossible that you lose her trust. Even if she did exactly as you feared. Even if you were to be removed from the ship, from her life, you must still do it. You have no choice. Garrus growled and swung wide, Thane unable to avoid the entire swing, catching a glancing blow to his retreating shoulder, Garrus earning a hard strike to abdominal plates, edging on the waist, exquisitely painful. I have choices. That's what command is. I have to... With that partial declaration, Thane had lost his patience with discussion on even ground and opted for a more direct demonstration of his argument. Garrus pitched forward, didn't even see how Thane got him in that position, but Thane's hand still protected his fall, kept his face from smashing into the mat with the force of the fall that could have shattered his nose or mandibles. Thane did not apply biotic restraint. Caressed at his throat and waist, Thane's voice in his ear. It did not occur to Garrus that he would want to leave this position. Ever. In Vasnam, you have no choice. I will not allow it. You will not tell her. I will speak, and you will listen. It was not venom, though Thane was moving his hands over Garrus's body. Just enough for pleasure, not enough for compulsion, just the leaping joy of his bondmate's hands on his hide, and Thane's obvious enjoyment. A gift, not of lust, but love. Not overwhelming command, but what? He listened. He wanted to hear. He wasn't compelled to hear. Thane's hands moved, his body and voice cherishing each moment of contact. Invasnam. That word from your language. A secret held so close to the heart that the tongue cannot reach. That is what you are. But perhaps I must make it clear. You are not a secret born of shame. I would declare, defy anyone, anything to have it known that you are mine. But just as I cannot be brought to care whether or not Tuchanka is saved, all I care for is that you know you are mine. That is why you have no choice. You are mine. The secret to my reason to live. You are mine to protect, mine to shelter, mine to own. I will stop you from devaluing yourself. In this case, you are correct. She is unreasonable and will remain so. You, however, are not. You can understand when I say any polite fiction about how your will belongs to you and only you. You are permitted to keep only when your will is used well. If you fail to see how much I rely upon you, I will remind you of what should already be branded upon your spine, what should sink into your blood each time I touch you. I am a selfish and petty man in several ways, ways that you understand. I own you. I am not humble before the fact that you bonded with me. I am intensely proud and possessive, and if you dare to imply that I had no choice, that you had no choice, I will tell you again, Invasnam, that I own you. I need you, and for my own selfish and petty reasons. No harm will come to you despite your best efforts to be separate and bear all blame and weight of all the worlds upon your wide shoulders. You struggle to save everyone. You struggle to protect her, and you would harm yourself. And I will not allow it. Thane bit at the side of Garrus's throat, trembles and melting in the essence of bond in each word, each hard and soft syllable. Nails and palm. Thane's mouth lingered on his hide for long, melting moments as wide shoulders relaxed. I will give you logic, and I will give you inevitability. Jane's brain is as it is in its natural state. Now it is altered. She must recover. She must recover. And you will realize that is your priority because Karen says so. Jane will not be put into the position of placing her recovery in danger. If she were to give an order that she was to later learn was influenced by lack of capacity, we are all doomed. I can care about that because I must, logically. You care emotionally. For myself, Invasnam, I would carry you both away and chain you to a wall to keep you safe, except that you would hate me for it. For my part, were you to chain me to a wall, I would be grateful for the opportunity. And there is the difference. I own you, and I care for you exclusively. You care for everything, and I love you for it, but I cannot allow you to make a choice based on you finally realizing that millions, possibly billions, possibly trillions of lives will be lost. For me, that is a number, one with no value next to the value of your life alone. You will care, and I will keep you from going too far. Trust me. You spoke before witnesses that you would follow my lead, and although you have command in this moment, you are not alone. Own me, own my thoughts, own my choices. Take in Vasnam, and own the right to demand my thoughts, demand my service. It will be given. With Thane's clarity, the resentment and fear sank, willing to allow Thane's merciless and selfish logic to define a moment, close the door. The intimacy and immediacy in his blood, all he could feel. To have permission to not care for a moment, to be cared for instead. Thank the spirits, Thane was not interested in only verbal assurance, his hissing voice moving to demonstration, his hands rough, demanding and selfish. Choice made. Together, without argument, without coercion, but with the knowledge that Thane would command him to stand his ground, stand up to her and her insanity, that Thane would stand with him, and that even she could not stop them when they were right together. Proof of concept in Thane's demanding body, Garrus twisting his neck to welcome Thane's kiss, possible now because of already being of like mind. Thane speaking of his petty selfishness while so very carefully preserving Garrus's opportunity to rebel. An opportunity he did not want, cast aside. Venom and reverie on the tips of their tongues, and no more words. Thane demonstrated and took ownership of Garrus's body. No polite, seductive fictions permitted, but fabric shoved aside. Thane's hand on his cock, the exquisite welcome of Thane's fingers requiring Garrus's full surrender. Garrus embraced the bliss of his bondmate, of acceptance of choices made, of relinquishing helplessness to the hands of his intent and sure lover, cold clarity and heated hands. Thane had to break the kiss with a growl to position himself, position Garrus to his liking, Thane's blood on his tongue from the broken lip. Venom enhanced and did not mask intent. Reverie made each pass of Thane's teeth on sensitive hide, his tongue on plate rifts, all the signposts and destiny he needed. Thane's teeth on his back, one hand on Garrus's hip, holding him in place like his hip spur was a handle. Thane's body was like his words, only the shadowed and supposed selfishness of the way he saw himself, with the freighted and knowing giving with all the unspoken and implied passion. Lovingly ironic, giving while defining it as taking, owned while owning. Perfection not only from this man's mouth, but in every moment. Each stroke of Thane's hand along Garrus's cock intended to give pleasure, each thrust of possessive hips trembling with every ounce of implied selfishness. Both of them knew that with this much license, this much ownership, Thane would come, trembling, spent, and Garrus would be hard forever for this man, with no respite, no end to seeking his body, and Garrus would have to arch his spine to reach the man's mouth at the same time that his cock was inside, to stay, to twist and seek until Thane's eyes had to close and all control fled, his hissing voice. Thane lasted as long as he could, trembling and thrusting heat and friction of scraping plate, drawing him to the end of his strength, the end of his endurance. His harsh groans and gulping, gasping repetition of Garrus's name, like a prayer. Garrus let Thane cling to his back, harsh breath glow and rush, and not aftermath. After was a long way away. Garrus was going to very gently disentangle himself, lay that man back down while he was regaining his breath, and then take his breath away again. Find his home, find his mate. Watch as Thane's eyes struggled to stay open, as his lungs wrenched each breath and his hands lost their strength. I own you. I love you. I am going to show you.